Could it be possible that a cow knocking over a lantern could actually cause $200 million worth of damage in Chicago City? That's the rumor. In 1871, there was a Chicago fire that burned so fast that the fire changed the architecture of the city forever. It stripped the city bare and made it possible for the world's first skyscrapers. The fire started on October 8th, later in the evening, and burned until October 10th, early in the morning in 1971. It's said that over 300 people died and there were 100,000 left homeless. That figure represents 1 in 3 that were left homeless in the city. 17,500 buildings were destroyed, to the point where there was actually an area that was called a burnt district, and it was 4 miles long and a mile wide that ran through the city's business district. Now, what would be a reason to cause a fire to burn so fast and so quickly through a city? Well, you have to remember at that time in Chicago that it was the fastest growing city there in 1871. Cities and the buildings were constructed so quickly to deal with the population growth, such as the immigrants that were coming in, that shoddy materials were used, and definitely materials of cheap combustible materials. Buildings that were made of wood and could become very dry, especially during this time because there was a drought. 4 months prior to the big fire in Chicago, there was only 2.5 inches of rain that fell in the city. Then, to add to the insult to injury, the evening of the fire, there was gusting 20 miles per hour winds. Once the fire started, it burned the city's gaswork, which then added fuel to the firestorm. Now, what this did is it caused what's called a convection effect, which allowed the concentrated updraft in the fire so that the fire was able to move without necessarily any wind. So what that means is that the flames were carried high up in the air and jumped over the actual river twice. So it spread the fire even more quickly. Another reason behind the fire continuing on and not being put out quickly is firefighters were very exhausted and very tired because of the drought. There was 20 fires that happened the previous week. On top of that, they were given the wrong directions to the fire, so that led them to take a little bit longer to get there. We talked a little bit earlier about how there was rapid growth in the city. Well, because of this drought, the buildings that were made of wood were very dry, so they caught on fire very quickly. Then only one water station was in the city, and that was to serve the entire city. So once it caught on fire, because it was made of pine, it stopped the firefighters right in their tracks. So what is it that made Chicago the city that it is today? How did it recover from this great tragedy? Well, Joseph Medill, who was the publisher of the Chicago Tribune-Times at that time, said Chicago will rise from the ashes. And when we read in the encyclopedia and in articles in history, we see that immediately after the fire, the city came together and started raising capital for the fire rebuilding. We just briefly talked about the publisher there of the Chicago Tribune. Well, his platform was to have stricter building and fire codes. So 1 month after the fire, he was elected mayor. So then what happened because of this? We have the City of Illinois Fire Department codes that when you research, because of this fire in 1871, it caused a major restructuring of the codes. There was no longer any wooden buildings allowed. Materials had to then be fireproof, which meant they were made of brick or stone or marble or limestone. Then the iron industry was developed further because they were able to develop fireproof iron columns that had porous terracotta in the center of them. So because of all of this, of the city coming together, within 1 week there was actually 6,000 temporary structures erected. Began a new architectural vision and a new construction technique because they weren't able to have any more land. They only had still the specific amount of land, but still with all this population influx, they were only allowed to build up. but because of the way buildings were constructed before, the exterior of the buildings were what provided the support. Well, no longer could the land support that kind of a heavy construction, so out of this came an interior steel skeleton construction. So now the exterior of the building was just strictly to protect the interior of the much more lighter weight steel skeleton construction. This allowed for the first skyscraper to be built. It was called the Home Insurance Building, that was built in 1884. And then post-fire, Chicago is now known as the most fireproof city in the country. It has the most strict building codes and rules so that a great fire like this was not to happen again. So this fire of 1871, many say it was bound to happen because of the quick influx of the population, as well as everything being made out of wood and everybody being compacted together. But this forced a change in the building codes, and then this laid the groundwork for the country's first skyscrapers. So, as always in our country's history, out of tragedy came change. From this great Chicago fire of 1871, this created an opportunity for the city to literally rise from the ashes.